So my name is Chris Bolek. I'm here as the mayor of the city of Elizabeth. And for those of you that are outside of our city, I welcome you to the Elizabeth. So I welcome all of you to the Elizabeth Public Library. This is a Carnegie library. The funds were donated by Andrew Carnegie in the early 1900s. So we're really proud of all the work that goes on here. Mary Faith Shamil is our executive director. I don't know if she's still here. She was mixing around before. She's the executive director of the library. And I have to tell you, I'm really honored to host New Jersey Future here in a discussion on the CSO as well as climate change. Here in the city of Elizabeth, we do not believe it is a hoax. We believe it is real. And we believe it affects our communities in a very negative way. And we have to plan for the future so we can leave something for our children and those that come after us. I'd now like to ask Mo from New Jersey Future to say a few words and thank a lot of the partners who are here as well. Mo?
Thank you so much, Mayor Chris Bolek. And thank you all for coming out tonight to this meeting here, this forum here in Elizabeth. We're here today because 21 cities, that was the mayor's slide. 21 cities in New Jersey have combined sewer systems. And when it rains, these sewer systems become overwhelmed and sewage is dumped into our rivers and streams and backs up sometimes into our basements and onto our streets. And in a few months, municipalities and wastewater treatment plants will submit their plans to reduce the amount of sewage overflows. The question we're asking today is, will these projects be ready for climate change? What information do we need? Who needs to be involved? And how do we move forward with climate change at the core of our decision-making process? The conversation does not end today. I want you to take this information back to your communities, back to your elected officials, back to your utilities, and back to your long-term control plans, and have this conversation, ask the question, how are we thinking about climate change in our long-term control plans? So it's the CSO slide, the quintessential CSO slide. I'm assuming everybody here knows what this is. And I want to thank a lot of partners, a lot of folks participated in this event. It was hosted by New Jersey Future, but it was really collaboration. So the Sewage Free Streets and Rivers campaign partnered with Rutgers Climate Change Alliance. And we had a steering committee who worked on this. It was the advisory committee for Sewage Free Streets and Rivers. And Marjorie Kaplan and Jean Herb also participated in that as well. And then these are all the sponsors, also local groups, Groundworks Elizabeth, Future Cities Inc., ANJEC, all participated in sponsoring this. And we want to thank the City of Elizabeth for sponsoring and hosting us, as well as the library for accommodating us today. So this is our program. We have a great speaker, so I also want to thank all the speakers tonight for coming out, spending your time to come out and be with us for this event. And I would like to invite Marjorie Kaplan to come up and start us off with her expertise on climate change and the projections for New Jersey.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. I want to take my time. Okay, well, there you go. Oh boy, this is going to be complicated. What?
You want this one?
Yeah. Oh, no, it's stand. Yeah. I'm going to turn this off. Then I don't have it. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yes. Well, great. Thank you for coming, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Good evening. Tonight, Environmental and Green Sustainability Program is taking place on the 4th floor.
You're all here. This is adorable. Okay, so I'm going to move fast because Mo asked me to cover a lot of things in a little bit of time. And it's nice to see you, Drew. I put a slide in here just for you. Okay. Okay, so climate change is real. It's happening now. It's affecting New Jersey. Basically, I could just tell you that it's getting warmer, it's raining more, and sea levels are rising, and maybe I could leave. Would that be okay? But that's what we're going to talk about. So Earth's global surface temperatures in 2019 were the second warmest since record keeping began in 1880, according to two independent analyses, those by NASA and NOAA. And just real quickly, since the 1880s, the average global surface temperature has risen, and the average temperature is now more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a bit more than 1 degree Celsius above that of the late 19th century. And you see there's year-to-year variability, but overall the trend is going in one direction, with it becoming more accentuated after the 1970s. And New Jersey, pretty much in large part, is consistent with these trends. The average annual temperature rises over 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the past 100 years. You can see the temperature points fluctuate, but the statistical smoothing, I see we have students here, so you will learn statistics. It's really great to see young people here. Great, I work at the university, so I love to see that. But we see the regression line, and the point is that if you look at the overall trend, it's going in the same way, and there's been more rapid warming since 1970. The 13 warmest years in our state occurred since 1998, and 2012 was the warmest year on record in this state. So what's going to happen in the future? So this is an image from the National Climate Assessment. It shows how annual average temperatures are predicted to change across the United States by mid-century, the top two maps, and by the end of the century on the bottom two maps. And these are under different scenarios we call greenhouse gas emission scenarios for the future, and the one on the lower emissions is on the left-hand side of each map, and the higher emissions is on the right-hand side of the map. And the higher emissions is sort of the way we've been tracking because we haven't been regulating these things in the national level. The seasonal differences in the Northeast temperature have decreased in recent years because winters have warmed 3 times faster than summers. So by the middle of this century, winters are projected to be milder still, with fewer cold extremes, particularly across inland and northern portions of the Northeast. So now we'll talk about precipitation. So there's been a long upward trend of over 2 inches of mean annual precipitation per 100 years. There's a large decadal variability. The variability in rainfall is much greater than in heat on temperature. But there was a drought in the early 1960s. It was wet in the 1970s. And it was very wet in the 2000s. And 2018 was the wettest year on record. When we look at seasonal precipitation trends in the 20th century, most of the upward trend comes from 5% increases in spring and fall precipitation. But what may be more important, however, which is important to this audience, is not the total.
Owners of some transportation.
Can I keep speaking?
Yes.
It's not the total number. This is just like an alternate universe. It's not the total number of inches of rain, but that when it rains in heavier events, okay? As these maps from the National Climate Assessment show, the observed percent change in several metrics of extreme precipitation by region over varying time periods for the 20th and into this century, the 21st century. And I'm not going to get into all the details of these maps, but overall the picture is the same. We're seeing large increases in the eastern half of the United States and smaller increases or slight decreases in the western United States. So what's going to happen in the future? In a warmer world, as this image from the National Climate Assessment shows, further increase in rainfall intensity are expected, with increases in precipitation expected during the winter and the spring, with a little change in the summer. And monthly precipitation in the Northeast is projected to be, from the National Climate Assessment, about 1 inch greater for December through April by the end of the century under the higher emissions scenario. But ironically, in a warmer world, water will evaporate more rapidly in areas where you can get dry spells. This is important. So in parts of the Northeast, like New Jersey, when you do have a dry spell, these dry spells may lengthen. So now we'll talk quickly about sea level trends. The century scale global sea level has been about 1.7 millimeters a year. This rate has nearly doubled in the past 2 decades. Sea level in New Jersey is rising more rapidly than the global average because our land is sinking from for geologic purposes, and over the last 40 years, the rate of sea level rise has been 0.2 inches per year, or double the global average of 0.1 inch per year. And sea level, these are the tide gauges, Sandy Hook's on the tops, Atlantic City on the bottom. But just to give you a frame of reference, we've had about 17.6 inches, about 1.5 feet of sea level rise in Atlantic City since records began in 1911, compared with 7.6 inches globally. And I wouldn't get all hung up on the numbers. I'm sure these folks will you can have my slides, no problem. So don't worry about that. And this report you can have by going to our website. This is the recent New Jersey Science and Technical Advisory Panel report on sea level rise for New Jersey. It was chaired by Rutgers professor Robert Kopp and included distinguished scientists from throughout New Jersey and nationally. And it provides a wealth of data and projections. But tonight, I'll just, for simplicity's sake, focus on the high end of what we call the likely range, because that may be the sort of thing that decision makers would want to focus on when planning for critical infrastructure like wastewater treatment systems. So you can read the report to get the complete set of projections, but by 2030, the New Jersey panel projects a likely range that could be as high as 1.1 feet of sea level rise above a year 2000 baseline. By 2050, a likely range that could be as high as 2.1 feet higher than the levels in the year 2000. And after 2050, the rise is adjusted based on emission scenarios. We project on emission scenarios, as I mentioned. And so under high emission scenarios, which is what I'll just mention, but I show you the low emissions, the likely range by 2070 could be as high as 3.5 feet above year 2000 values. Then we go on and we have 2100 values and we have up to 2150. So a wastewater system that may have a design life of 50 years might like to think about projections in the 2070 year time horizon. And why does this matter? Well, we already know that in New Jersey, 70% of the census tracts for the most socially vulnerable populations in the state. Those are the census tracts in the orangey, darker colors. Those populations who have underlying social conditions that are correlated with their ability to respond and recover to disaster, they live now within the 100-year floodplain. That's the map on the right. We also know that 13 of 147 hospitals in the state and 26 of 548 nursing homes in New Jersey are already located within the current 100-year floodplain. And so, as we continue to see more extreme precipitation and as sea level rises, we have to be concerned that flooding we're already seeing from things like CSOs can be exacerbated. So very quickly, some of the considerations that Mo asked me to talk about. We'll talk about sunny day flooding, inundation, sea level rising storms, ancillary benefits of green infrastructure, and precipitation very briefly. So Mo's already, so let's see. Did I skip a slide? I don't think so. I'm just going to talk to you about quickly mentioning sunny day flooding. This is high tide flooding. It's referred to as called sunny day, nuisance, recurrent, shallow coastal, or sunny day flooding occurs in the absence of a storm event. It happens when we have the highest of the high tides. It's flooding that leads to inconveniences, road closures, and affects mostly low-lying areas, exposed assets such as infrastructure, roads, harbors, beaches, private and commercial properties, and it can overwhelm stormwater drainage capacity. And it can cause general deterioration and corrosion of infrastructure that's not designed to withstand frequent inundation or saltwater exposure. And with sea level rise, nuisance flooding is becoming more frequent and increasing in depth and extent. So why does that kind of matter? So I kind of feel like I'm out of order on my slides. Well, we showed you about the CSOs, but here is when we have sea level rise. Mo showed you this slide already about how a combined sewer system, sets up, and it's designed to fall out to go to the sewage treatment plant. But then if we have high rates of precipitation, we'll get outfall to a Piper River. But remember, sea levels have already risen to 1.5 feet in the last 100 years. So if you hear water in the storm drain more frequently, your stormwater system doesn't seem to be effective as it was in the past, then there could be because water isn't able to get out. So this little cartoon is just helping to show you under the right conditions, wastewater can back up, and these will occur more frequently during sunny day flooding. So these are images from our report. These, we showed you, they're images of nuisance flooding from Atlantic City on the left and Ventnor on the right. This is happening in areas of New Jersey already. And we know that this frequency is going to increase with sea level rise, so we should be careful about that. So I want to just tell you about a few tools that we developed at Rutgers in concert with many partners. And we have something called the flood mapper, where you can look strictly at sea level rise and inundation, and you can also, though, look at total water levels that combine sea level rise on top of storms. So here's Sunny Day flooding. The top map is actually a map of Elizabeth, and I just put this because we're in Elizabeth, and that shows you where some of the CSO households are. And the bottom area shows you roughly the same kind of place where we might expect to see some of this if we actually reach 2 feet above mean high water, which is what NOAA calls a nuisance flood. And so those green areas there are areas that might be your tell areas where you might want to look first to see if you're going to see some of these things. And then I also included the Stevens Institute Flood Advisory Service tide levels and projections for Sandy Hook up there, which is the tide gauge closest to where we are. And the black dotted line is at the 2-foot nuisance day flooding threshold. And this was just the data for this past weekend. And you can see we weren't at that level here. But this is just something for you guys to pay attention to. Oh boy. Well, I only have a minute left, so I better keep talking. But Pete told me I could have a few on this second, so
I'm not in charge.
You're not in charge? Okay. So we can also look at total water levels with our tools. We look at the 50-year planning horizon because that's, you know, the lifetime of these treatment plants. This can show you areas. This is an area, I think this is in Perth and Boy, where you would see just inundation by 2070. And then you can put a storm tide on top of that. And this is a 2070 with a sandy storm tide on top of that. So you can go to the tools and see it. Are some of the treatment plants in New Jersey actually paying attention to this? Yes, people are actually looking at this. PVSC actually is designing a flood wall. I'm not here to comment on the design or anything about whether you like it or don't like it. But the point I'm making is that they actually have taken this to heart, and they actually have used a 500 storm elevation. They put in an uncertainty factor. They've used a sea level rise value of 2.6 feet by 2070, which they did before we came out with our last report, but it tracks pretty well, the numbers, and they've done other modeling. So there's work like this going on. We also have tools that look at historic and projected temperature historic temperature trends and changes now in something called New Jersey Forest Adapt. And you can see that areas of the state may not all heat up equally going forward into time under different scenarios. And we can also think to ourselves, okay, so this is a map of heat island effect that Sustainable Jersey had put together. And what I want to just talk to you about the fact is, and this is the one I put in for you, Drew, is that the orange and the brightest yellow are the warmest areas. And so you'll find true urban areas which don't contain large amounts of vegetation. Trees, green roofs, and vegetation can help reduce the urban heat island effect by shading building surfaces, deflecting radiation from the sun, releasing moisture into the atmosphere. And so if part of your CSO strategy is to use green infrastructure, you will have an additional climate benefit in terms of heat, as well as in potentially mitigating emissions because you'll be sequestering carbon. And then finally, I'll mention historic and projected precipitation. So we do in our new tool, we do have information about what we think will be the average in historic from the change. We can see the percent change or the inches of change in mean monthly precipitation in the state. As I showed you in the climate data, precipitation has a very year-to-year variability. So you should have some special caution in interpreting local precipitation projections. Translating the results from global climate models to local scales is a very active area of research for scientists in the state, and it's a priority for research and analysis. So we can't tell you tomorrow what the extreme storm is going to be for CSO purposes, but we're trying to figure that one out. So that's my talk. Okay, did I come in on
Marjorie, thank you very much for setting the stage there for the climate change that we are all going to be facing and that we're going to have to plan for. Another hand for Marjorie, please. So my name is Pete Kasabak. I'm the Executive Director of New Jersey Future. We're one of the hosts this evening. How many people have heard of New Jersey Future? All right, good. So I'm going to go into my long speech about who New Jersey Future is and what we do. No, I'm kidding. New Jersey Future. At New Jersey Future, we believe that great places help create great lives. And we do that by focusing particularly on land use issues, which includes how do we redevelop our communities, our cities, our towns, and how do we build the infrastructure for the future. We're an advocate, we're a researcher, we're a convener, and then we help local governments and state and county governments solve these problems. You heard a little bit about the climate change side of what we're here to talk about tonight. But where are we on the CSO side, on the combined sewer system? We know that we have 25 municipalities and wastewater treatment plants, most of them in the northeast part of the state, as you saw on the maps, that are in their final stages of selecting alternatives to combined sewer overflows. That's the final stage of creating their long-term control plans. In 4 months, they're going to submit these plans, as long-term control plans, to the Department of Environmental Protection. The plans are going to be implemented over the next 30 to 50 years, costing millions and even billions of dollars, while these same communities are going to be adapting to climate change while they're implementing these plans. We now have new information, more information than we had in the past, and more information than when this permitting process started 5 years ago, that looks at the new projections around sea level rise, new understanding of how storms are going to come more frequently and are going to be more severe and more variable. And we're going to continue to gather more information and more data about this, understanding the impacts that climate change is going to have on our communities and on how we build the infrastructure that we have going forward. So how do we use this information to ensure that we rebuild our wastewater infrastructure to be resilient and address the communities who are being impacted most severely? Each of our panelists tonight, plays an important role in this process. Our panel is going to discuss their role in addressing climate change and our water infrastructure upgrades together. I'm going to introduce each of them as they speak. So our first speaker is Mayor Chris Bolek, who you've already heard from. And the format this evening is we're going to give each presenter a chance, about 5, 6, 7 minutes, to tell you about their perspective from where they sit. And then we're going to go into some questions and answers, and then open it up to the audience for questions as well. So as you're listening, as you're hearing things, think about questions that you may have for our panelists as we go forward. Mayor.
Thank you, Pete. So climate change is something as an issue as a mayor that we have to deal with in a very local way. As part of the trustee board of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we work really hard on trying to develop policies that affect the mayors throughout the entire nation. So here in the city of Elizabeth, we've done a few things in order to deal with climate change. That after Hurricane Sandy, we are a waterfront community. For those of you that do not know the city of Elizabeth, we also have a CSO issue that my staff actually briefed me on yesterday, that if we were to correct everything to the best of our ability would cost anywhere between $350 million to $1 billion in the city of Elizabeth. We don't have that money. And even though it has to be done over a period of 20 to 30 years, there was no way that we could put that on the backs of the taxpayers of the city of Elizabeth to correct the overflow problem in that short period of time. So therefore, it needs help from the federal government and or the state government, and as all of you know, that doesn't look real promising either. Matter of fact, the federal government under President Trump will weaken the clean water issues and therefore probably for mayors drive the cost of this down because they will not need as many permits in the future for some of these issues. That's not a good thing for the future of the planet, but that's a reality on what's probably going to happen if this guy gets reelected for the next 4 years. In the city of Elizabeth, we've worked with Groundwork Elizabeth in making sure that we have gardens throughout the city of Elizabeth. Every school in our city has a garden. All the senior citizen complexes have gardens. In my State of the City speech last year, I committed to the city building and planting 2,500 trees. Last year we planted 1,000. where we sent a notice to all of the residents of our city and said that the city will plant a tree free wherever you want it on your property, in the backyard, in the front yard, and here are 6 or 8 different designs of trees that you can pick from. So last year the program went extremely well. I think we planted 1,117 trees to that effect. In some areas where the city has flooded, what we've done is we've put in million-gallon tanks below the surface in order to hold the stormwater for eventual discharge when the tide gets lower. Hurricane Sandy came up on our shores on the waterfront in our city, lost our pier, where we have a recreation pier in the city of Elizabeth. While we were not as damaged severely as other communities, you can see firsthand on what climate change and strong storms will do. I grew up in the city of Elizabeth. I don't ever remember as a boy storms that would last for 5 or 7 minutes at a really intense pace and then go away with street corners flooded because the sewers that were built 50 to 75 to 100 years ago can't handle the runoff. That happens today on a frequent basis in storms that affect our urban communities. As all of you know, a lot of urban communities are a lot of cement and macadam. So therefore, planting of trees will help some of this runoff. I'm hopeful that when we reach the 2,500 goal of trees on front lawns, back lawns, parks, and anywhere else we can plant them, that we can start this process again and plant 25 more hundred trees over the next couple of years. This was an expense that the city of Elizabeth has incurred. We had received some grant money, but not a lot through the County of Union in order to do this. So the high intensity storms is probably our biggest short range challenge. Our biggest long range challenge is preparing for that CSO problem that I just spoke about and the cost that will incur in order for us to complete it.
Yeah, I'll just take it first.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. You mentioned that you've lived your all your life, and that you've been mayor almost 20 years.
28.
28 years.
But who's counting?
28 years. Are there other things that you're seeing as a result of climate change that are affecting your community? You had mentioned the piers. You had mentioned the storms. Is there anything else that you're noticing at this point, or those are the big things?
They are the big things, but it's interesting to note when you get phone calls from people when their neighborhood floods and it says, my neighborhood never flooded before, Mayor. Why are you doing this? They actually think I sit in a room and flip a switch and say, flood that neighborhood tomorrow, which is, a clear result of climate change. And that is probably the biggest local challenge we face, is getting phone calls that say, hey, my neighborhood never flooded before. And it's not because of over construction. I mean, we have a lot of people on 11 square miles, 130,000 people on 11 square miles, which causes part of the problem as well. But keep in mind, 20 years ago, we had 122,000 people on 11 square miles. 40 years ago, we had 113,000 people on 11 square miles. So it's not like there's been a population and a huge growth. We've seen growth in the population. However, it's the intensity of the storms and the stormwater system that's been put in place in the early 1900s that can't deal with it. And then we're a waterfront community. So high tide is going to cause us great difficulty in discharging. So therefore, the short-term fix is to build these million-gallon tanks underneath the ground. And even 2 of them failed the last time we had a major storm on Trumbull Street in the area going to the mall. The owner of one property called me up and said, Mayor, I thought you told me this million-gallon tank was going to work. I said, it did. It worked for the last 4 hours. It just, this last hour, it's filled the capacity.
Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Dave Rosenblatt, who is New Jersey's first Chief Resilience Officer, thanks to Executive Order 89 by the current governor. And he's going to talk a little bit about this from the DEP's perspective, but specifically from the climate change point of view. He's going to.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you need the clicker.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
No. Can you turn that one on? Or?
I thought I did. Hello?
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Good evening. Hey. All right. I'm Assistant Commissioner of Climate and Flood Resilience Program in the state. I used to be Assistant Commissioner of Engineering and Construction. As a result of all the activities and trends promoted by Governor Murphy and Commissioner McCabe, we combine engineering and construction with coastal land use planning to get the current climate and flood resilience program. EO 89 was very significant for us. It required that the department produce a science report related to climate change that could be used to direct all activities in the state as a scientific basis for activities. We formed an interagency council involving at least 20 state agencies where we sit and debate, discuss, prepare for climate change issues. And we are going to produce by September 2020 a climate change strategy and coastal resilience plan together. It's very, very aggressive in the context of what we have to do and also in the time frame we have to do it. And if that wasn't enough, yesterday, Governor Murphy signed Executive Order 100, which required a lot of work by state government. First, for us, integrate climate change considerations such as sea level rise into its regulatory and permitting programs, including but not limited to land use permitting, water supply, stormwater, wastewater permitting and planning, air quality, and solid waste and site remediation permitting. That's a lot. That's a sea change, you know. Well, definitely. So on the heels of the executive order, the commissioner announced an administrative order, which really got to the details of what the department has to do in order to meet the goals of the executive order. We need to prepare a report recommending regulatory measures necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, proposed regulations incorporate climate change considerations into all kinds of state regulations and rules, coastal zone management rules, freshwater wetlands rules, flood hazard control act rules, stormwater management rules, and any other regulation or guidance which references or otherwise addresses flood storage, flooding, or inundation. We've got it covered. All right. Within 12 months, we'll incorporate climate change considerations into all relevant grant and loan contracting programs implemented by the department. And within 12 months, incorporate climate change considerations into all relevant planning, policy guidance, communications, educational materials issued by the department. So if you didn't think we were serious with the EO 89, EO 100 clarifies that very well. All right. Okay. So I'm delving into Marjorie's territory a little bit here, but I can say that we have numbers regarding sea level rise for the first time. I am not going to dwell on these numbers right now. I want you to look at the report, the Rutgers report. It's on their website. It's on our website for climate change. But what is significant is what we do next with these numbers. It's nice to say we have numbers. We turn them over to you and say, have fun, but that's not our intention. We intend to issue sea level rise guidance. How do you use these numbers? We are looking at a time frame here that we don't usually look at. We have numbers that go out to 2150, and we need to start planning for that. Now, at the first glance, you look at 2030 and 2050. Even those are significant planning ranges for us to start taking action now, or even start planning for action now. But then we go out to 2070 and 2100. So one of the things that we dwell on in the department, in my office, is how do we change the public's line of sight into the future? How do we get the public to start thinking, we need to start making changes now? We need to accept new ordinances. We need to accept new budgets that start to get to root problems associated with increased precipitation and increased sea level rises. How do we do that? Carefully, but quickly. I guess that's one way to look at it. And I'll leave it there. I want you to look at this report, and when we issue the sea level rise guidance as a draft, we can all sit down and discuss it. You can tell us where we're right, where we're wrong, and what you'd like to see us do. So not only do we have numbers, but we have tools to use these numbers. This is based on New Jersey Flood Mapper, I believe. It's a program. You can find that on the Rutgers site, and you can find it on New Jersey's climate change site also. If you add 2 feet of sea level rise, you'll see the shaded areas down below. I might be blocking it. No? Here, I'll say it out of the way. There we go. All right, 2 feet of sea level rise. You see the shaded areas down below in particular. 4 feet of sea level rise. Now, if you go back to the chart, you see 2 feet of sea level, or 2 feet is in 2050, 4 feet, you're getting into 2100. But you're coming close. 17% chance of the numbers being less than 3.5, okay? 4 feet. With Flood Mapper, you can do this all day. You can put a number in there, look at sea level rise. You can also add a surge, all right? It's fun. It's fun, and it helps you think. It helps you think about what it is we're facing in the future. And when I show you the real numbers, all right, plug these numbers into the program, take a look. You can go to Flood Mapper, you can start to pull up some of the critical infrastructure, residences, you'll know. Use it, use the tool. NewJerseyFloodMapper.org. I will leave you with that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Has anyone used any of these online tools before? Flood Mapper or Marjorie has. Okay. Anyone else? All right. Great. Very good. We're now going to turn it over to Janice Brogel, who's the director of the Department of Environmental Protection's Division of Water Quality. So you heard from Dave, who is looking at the climate change impacts and how that's affecting New Jersey. Janice's job is to look at these long-term control plans and water quality side, the infrastructure side of what we're dealing with, and how we then bring these two things together. So Janice.
Okay, I need to stand up. So Dave was talking about looking into the future, and I'm here because I'm talking about CSOs, which is dealing with our past legacy and what we're going to do about it today and going future and look into the future. So I know that we mentioned we've got these over 200 CSOs in 21 communities, and they're discharging millions, that would be nice, billions of gallons of raw sewage mixed with precipitation every year. So obviously, we really do need to deal with that today. So as was mentioned, we issued our CSO permits almost 5 years ago. And our CSO communities, including Elizabeth, have been working really hard in the past 5 years to come up with their plan on how to deal with this. So what they've been doing in the past couple of years is the very first step is they had to map their entire system, understand their system. Where are the combined sewers? Where are the separate sewers? Where's overflows? Where are they occurring? Where is there flooding occurring? Where are all the catch basins? And then they had to take the information and they had to do some modeling of their systems. They had to understand, how does their system react to different precipitation events, different flow events, what goes on? So something like this, the community has 37 different CSO alcohol points, and this is from their one of their reports, and you can see they're looking at what's the volume, the frequency, the duration of the flows during different conditions. And then last summer, they took all this information and they're looking at different alternatives, different controls to how does the system react to these different controls? If you put in storage, how much can you reduce? Where are you reducing that flooding? And then with that, they're going to create the long-term control plans that you've been hearing about. And those are due in another 4 months. And those long-term control plans, they're the roadmap. Regardless of the climate change, we know what the end result is that we're all looking for. We're looking for a reduction, elimination of those CSO points. So one of the advantages New Jersey has is that we're going to, the long-term control documents in themselves are not an enforceable document. They're a plan. So what a lot of the states, a lot of communities across the country, how they incorporate these they incorporate them into an enforceable document, into a consent decree. And the problem with that is it's not very adaptable because as you've heard, some of these plans are 10, 20, 30 years before you get to the end point. And it's very difficult to say exactly what your route is going to be at the end of that 30 years. So what we're going to do, and what we have done, is we incorporate them into a permit. So in an example here, 20 years, our permits that we issue all the time, they're 5-year cycles. So every 5 years, we're issuing another permit. The first permit, we're going to be establishing, okay, here are the certain milestones that you need to meet. And we'll have some parameters there to see, did you get there or not? And then the next 5 years, we issue the next permit. And the advantage of that is it's really a very flexible, adaptive process. As I said, endpoint doesn't change. But what it allows us to do, just like we do with any of the permits that we issue, we have monitoring conditions. We have reporting, regular reporting that comes in. And every time, every 5 years, when we issue our other discharge permits, we look at that monitoring results. And we look at it and say, have conditions changed? Do we need to change those, our requirements? And we'll be doing the same thing with the long-term control plan. It gives us the opportunity to say, were our underlying assumptions correct? Any adjustments we need to make? So it really is an advantage as the science improves, as we get more information, we can work with the permittees and see if we need to make adjustments to stay on course. So the types of things that we're considering is, we'll want to look at what's your volume? Are you getting that reduction that you anticipated? What's the frequency of your flows, the durations? How much of that stormwater are you capturing? And most importantly too, we're going to be asking them, look at the rainfall data over the past 5 years. These are all sorts of parameters that the permittees have to consider in their modeling. And it gives us the opportunity that, if we're looking and going, I don't know, we may have to make some adjustments, that we can go back. Permittees can use their same modeling, all the work that they've done, and just be changing the input values to see, do we stay on this course or do we make adjustments? And one of the things to keep in mind too, Dave mentioned when you saw the maps there, the sea level rise. We're looking at inundation in about 30 years, 50 years, and hopefully, our target is within that time period, these CSOs should be reduced or eliminated. And I know I got my warning, But one of the other things I wanted to mention, the mayor talked about the cost of these systems. And under the division of water quality, we recognize that these are high costs. And we also provide funding. At this point, we provide funding of about $500 million a year to our, to wastewater treatment, drinking water facilities at about half market rate. We also provide principal forgiveness, and I've got my 1 minute warning. So we do recognize that these are high costs, and we are doing everything we can to also help the towns with that.
Thanks. And Jonas, before you sit down, I had a question for you. So you've talked about the process that the towns and utilities are going to need to go through. It's too late in the process to incorporate climate change into this particular planning process because there's only a few months left. What should the towns and utilities be thinking about? How would they incorporate this new information into the process that you've laid out?
I wouldn't say entirely that they have not incorporated climate change. As I said, our permittees have been looking and characterizing their systems. They did go back and they were looking at rainfall and the history of rainfall and using that for trying to predict, what was going to be the worst case, what they had to design for. And as I said, because this is every 5 years we can be looking at this, it really does give us the opportunity, if the science is showing that our assumptions on the intensity, duration has changed, we can input that into the model and see where we need to make adjustments.
If a town were to look at those projections, though, and say, the history is one thing, but the projections are a little more scary, and wanted to modify their plans or adjust their plans, would they have that opportunity?
They absolutely have that opportunity, and that's what we would want to see. As I said, it's the lesson learned from New Jersey from other towns is when you put it in an order and you don't allow the permittee to make adjustments as they gain new information or as conditions change, that is what becomes costly.
Right. Thanks. Dave, this question is for you. What other questions should towns and utilities be asking in order to make these kind of informed investment decisions? They're going, as you've heard, it's a 10, 20, 30-year implementation schedule. It can cost hundreds of millions, $1 billion. What kind of questions should the towns and utilities be asking related to climate change?
So in using the data, sea level rise numbers, temperature numbers, rainfall numbers, I think that, one, you have to consider the cost of whatever activity you're involved in, whether it's reconstruction of sewage systems or land development. Consider the cost, consider your risk averseness. Is that a word? Averseness? Yeah.
We'll go with that.
Well, yeah. What is the projected life, and third, what is the projected lifespan of whatever it is you're doing? If you're constructing a facility, is the lifespan 50 years? You want to plan out for 50 years, or more, because frequently we expect something and we design something to 50 years, and we know that homes and buildings last for 150 years. So we have not put out guidance, and I'm not providing guidance tonight off the cuff, but I think you should consider those three things when you look at our numbers.
Mayor, you've heard a little bit about the process the DEP is going through and some of the information that's available about climate change. Does this sound like a process that you can move through? Do you have concerns about it? Are there some questions that you may still have about how does Elizabeth?
Well, mayors always have questions, especially when it comes to balancing the construction of anything with the financial responsibility for a municipality. I mean, our total budget for the year, not counting schools, is about $250 million, $260 million. So when you talk about a program that's going to cost upwards of $350 million, you therefore can't figure out a way. Executive orders are nice, studies are nice. I like what he said, how do you get people to think past the horizon? That's a really challenging point, because if you go to somebody in your community and you say, listen, we're going to replace all of these sewers and it's going to cost $80 million and we have to bond it and it has to be done in 2 years, and your wastewater rates and your water rates are going to go up 50%, they're going to say, Mayor, are you nuts? You're not going to be here for the next term. So that just causes a chill in the entire process. And I recognize executive orders are important, and I recognize climate change is important, but unless there's a commitment at a state and federal level in order to deal with dollars, some of these projects are just not going to get done at the timeline that the state wants it to get done. The state does its job when she talks about $500 million. Keep in mind that's statewide. I'm talking about one city that's going to cost upwards of $350 million to get done. There's low interest loans. So therefore, this is going to be done in a step-by-step process. There's no city in this state that's going to do everything at once that the state wants in a very quick way, because the finances are just not available. We work really closely with the DEP and the EPA in making sure that our plan is in place. Our Public Works Department, our city engineer, has been working to do this. It's a process. I mean, just years ago when I was at a city council, I've been involved in government since 1983 when I was first elected to the city council, and then in 1992 I started my first term as the mayor of the city. So in the 1980s, we were forced with closing what was called the Westerly Interceptor, which transports sewage from other parts of the state into the joint meeting. And unless there was the necessary permits to fix it, they were not going to allow construction in any parts of the other city. So the city of Elizabeth had to embark on a multi-million-dollar plan to create a new westerly interceptor, increase the ability to have flow, increase the capacity in order to make sure that we can build in other parts of the city. We did that, cost millions of dollars, but explaining it to the taxpayer, who now saw their sewer charges double, was a really difficult proposition in the 1980s, but it was done. I talk with mayors around the country in Ohio, and where they're faced with the EPA and telling them they have to do things, they say, well, where's the money to do this? So it's a structural balance that has to be committed, and I can tell you that mayors will do what we have to in the plan and we'll have to in the study, but as far as implementation, it's got to be done in a step-by-step process because the money's just not there.